So I think, this comparison with angels, whether it's music or math, gives us a clearer sense of the unique human role within creation and how music might impact that role or shape it, right?
It sounds like you like the same parts of the Summa that I do. I love reading St. Thomas on angels and the properties of resurrected bodies. It's super interesting.
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, a resurrected body too. When you if music unites body and soul, then resurrection becomes an interesting category to consider too, right? Anyway, we could geek out on this for far too long. Welcome to the Making Every Class Catholic podcast. I'm Dr. Brett Sockel. This podcast and community are all about equipping Catholic educators like you to approach every subject area and your entire vocation as a teacher through the lens of our Catholic faith. Each month, I sit down with inspiring guests, and together, we'll explore how every classroom can become a place of faith, truth, and beauty. Thank you so much for being here. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if you know a fellow Catholic teacher, share this podcast with them. Let's build this community together. Welcome, everyone, to episode 6 of the Making Every Class Catholic podcast. I'm delighted to be joined today by Dr. Jennifer I was going to screw up your last name. I didn't say your first name right. Dr. Jennifer Donelson-Nowicka, joining us from San Francisco. Welcome to the show, Dr. Donelson-Nowicka.
Thanks for having me.
Why don't we start by telling people a little bit about your background, your position? You're at the Seminary, St. Patrick's Seminary in the Archdiocese of San Francisco, what your role is there. They'll know probably from the title that today we're talking about music. So what do you do at St. Patrick's?
So I kind of have two jobs. I am continuing the work that I did for a long time at St. Joseph Seminary in Dunwoody too. So I've been in seminary education for quite a while. And one of the things that I do is I train the seminarians, So what does that mean? That they have required coursework here. I've proposed 3 classes that are now a part of the curriculum. And those classes are in the propedeutic stage, that they learn about the role of beauty in the spiritual life. In the pre-theology, or what's now called the discipleship stage, they learn about Catholic ideas through art, architecture, and music. So it's kind of a survey class, but focused on what do these things mean and how do you have a real insight into what you're observing. And then the class that they have in the configuration stage, or theology 2, is the history and principles of sacred music, where we study church teachings on sacred music. And also I try to prepare them to be a good pastor and know all the things that they should know to run a really great music program. Beyond that, there's a seminary school of cantorum. So the guys are singing for all the liturgies. And more than that, when they participate in that, they really get the gist of how much time, for example, it takes to learn 30 seconds of music and make it sound really beautiful. It's a lot more than they usually expect. And it's a great process for them. And, they learn a lot of human virtue, good virtues through that process. And then every guy in the seminary gets half of his semesters here. He gets voice lessons. So I teach him how to actually use his voice. So it feels comfortable and it sounds good, doesn't sound non-prayerful and distracting like some priests will say that they sound. And in fact, some priests sometimes do, but they can learn how to sing well, learn how to read music, and then I teach them how to sing the Mass in English and Spanish. And so that's part of my job. But the other part of my job is that I am the founding director of the Catholic Institute of Sacred Music, which is a graduate school focused on preparing people to serve in Catholic parishes and schools. And we train them in theology, liturgy, history, in conducting, in choral building, vocal pedagogy, understanding really the church's music of Gregorian chant and sacred polyphony especially, but also how to really implement that in a way that becomes a vital part of every parish. And so we are in our third summer of offering summer graduate level classes. And then our hope is that next summer, we'll be able to start offering a 36 credit Masters of Sacred Music degree program, mostly during the summers. and 2 20-credit post-baccalaureate certificates, one in chant and one in sacred choral music. So that's our plan. But we have, an outreach just like any typical graduate school, that we have things that the general public can come to. And a lot of those things during the school year are online for free or very low cost.
Okay. Very good. Well, I'm already seeing some connections with what we talk about here at Making Every Class Catholic. Even your description of how the seminarians pick up human virtue by studying something. Some of them will have natural gifts for it, and some of them certainly will have limited gifts in that area.
Yeah.
And there's virtue to be gained no matter what your starting point
Absolutely
is there. And so that's one of the things we talk about here. But let's, as we shift to thinking about Catholic education in the sort of elementary and secondary contexts, and Catholic teachers, can we start with like a theoretical foundation? It almost sounds like a silly question, but I think it will be helpful. What is music?
Well, I would go to one of my main mentors. Of course, I didn't know him in person, but I have read a lot of his works, and that's Dom André Macaro, who is the French Benedictine, largely responsible for the revitalization of Gregorian chant in church consciousness and practice, and in many things. And he would say that sacred music, in his Aristotelian approach to the whole thing, is change through time. So it's a time art. It's not a plastic art. It's not something that once you build it, it exists in perpetuity, barring environmental factors. But it's an art that occurs in the moment. It's invisible, and because of its invisibility, it has a certain spiritual sort of characteristic. Now, there are also very many ways in which music can sound, and so not all of them are firstly spiritual. That music can express things like language, but with some limitations and some virtues that go beyond language. So what are the limitations when you compare it with language? It can't mean specifically in the same way, with the same great level of specificity that's embedded in language. But even language has ambiguities, right? This is like the source of marital disputes, like you said this and I thought you meant that, or whatever, there are different ways of interpreting things. This is the art of literary criticism too. And so there are ambiguities within language, but within music, there are even more ambiguities. But in the realm of those ambiguities, it has an import that is perhaps even greater than language. That there's you can cite, for example, and speak aloud the beautiful poetry of a beautiful translation of your favorite psalm. And there's a beauty there and an import that can make its way into your heart. For example, this is why it's important for children to learn and memorize beautiful poetry and speak it aloud. But there is something that goes beyond those words that's even more powerful than those words in the music. And so music is an important bearer of meaning in a way that is less specific than music, but even supra, I forget the word I'm looking for here, is supra, it's just transcending language.
Right.
And so it's expressive of, a context, whether it's for a dance or for a march or for a concert or for the sacred liturgy. It's expressive of ideas. The music itself can express ideas. And we have maybe not a one-to-one correspondence with this sound and that idea, but we all know that music can mean things. Like, and it says something without even having words. This is why people go to orchestral concerts.
Right.
That it is also beyond being expressive of context. It's expressive of one's interior life, that a composer has in his mind a sort of library of sounds that he's accumulated throughout his whole life. And once those sounds are in there, they start bopping around, and he creates new sounds, and then he puts them somehow into being, whether that's handing it on orally, handing it on through writing it down and having other people perform it. And so it's expressive of the individual person's act of co-creating with God, not ex nihilo, but out of the source of imagination. But beyond being expressive, we can't limit it to being simply expressive. That does not exhaust the ontological content of what music is. And I think this is something that the church has lost track of in the last 400 years. With the advent of modernism and, this idea that music is about genius and self-expression, but it actually is also formative. It changes us.
As you're talking, I'm thinking of a few like experiences of music that reflect what you're talking about, like to make it very concrete, right? So if I went to Mass on Sunday and they played a song at communion that was a song that my mentor, my doctoral director, had chosen for her own funeral. Mm-hmm. Well, I can't even sing it. I have to just sit quietly with my mouth shut, because if I start singing, I'm going to lose it, Right. And it's just, it has that kind of resonance. And something else from a completely different context. But I was just doing a little research. I'm fascinated by professional wrestling as like a performance art. And the when Hulk Hogan walked into the ring in the late 1980s, early 90s, there were like 3 chords that hit before he came through the curtain. Yeah. And it was a guaranteed communal experience. You didn't even see him yet. And the whole place exploded with 3 chords. And anyone who knows that song and grew up at that time knows exactly. And I was researching this, and they said the genius of it was, as soon as you heard that chord, you were part of a story, and you knew you were on the good guys team. Mm-hmm. And that someone who heard that when they were 8 years old, as a 45-year-old man, will hear that same 3 chords, and they will be in the same place they were when Hulk Hogan went down to face Andre the Giant at WrestleMania 3 or something like that, right? There's this way in which it sort of anchors something in you in a way that the words themselves would never be able to get that deep, Whether it's a funeral, whether it's a liturgical context, or a completely sort of secular, performance art, whatever it is, right? Yes. But it gives sort of concrete experience, and I think all of our listeners could probably reflect in their own lives about songs that have that kind of impact on them. They say people who with dementia in their 80s or 90s, if you play them a song from when they were 18 years old, whatever the big dance hall hit was when they were 18, they come alive, they start tapping their toes, they know the words, they don't know their own name. And sometimes they'll know the words to that song right. That was a dance hall hit when they were a young person.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's important to remember that music touches us in an affectively very deep way, and it has a specific link to memory. And so when we want to really hand on the faith, music is particularly effective at doing that, because the things that we learn in song, we really remember,
Right.
I mean, this is still a trick that, grade school teachers, for example, use all the time. I can, for example, from my student teaching days at a grade school, I can sing you all of the presidents, Washington and Adams, Jefferson and Madison, James Monroe and Adams JQ, but
for me, it was eyepiece times objective equals total magnification. Eyepiece times objective. That's grade 8 science, right? When we're learning how to use microscopes. But I got it. I know exactly, yep. How you get the total magnification. I know that calculation because it was music, right? So, okay, well, let's go another step then. So if that's what music is, then it has a particular kind of role in human life and culture, right? And that, I think, is going to be foundational for thinking about its role in any kind of education, first of all, and then Catholic education more specifically. So how do we think about music's role in human life? We've already started talking about it, but to be more specific, its role in our life and culture.
Yeah. You mean beyond the church? Yes.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. Like, let's do like the nature grace thing, right? So music is like a human reality that we all do, whether it's at wrestling events or at church, and then we'll talk about sacred music specifically. But I just want to think about music more generally as like an activity that humans do that has real human meaning because God created us. Well, I mean, your comments about it being in time, right? Mm-hmm. Like that's the kind of creature we are. We exist in time. Things like music fades into the past, right? After it sort of immediately, it has this really interesting connection with memory, which is also about its relationship with time, right? So there's all that kind of thing going on when we're engaging with music, when we're passing folk songs on to our kids, when we're learning the pop hits that, are so foreign to us now because we're old, but our kids like them. Like there's always this stuff going on,
Yeah. Well, I think if you look at the origins in terms of music, it's always been connected to kult, which is worship, an act of worship, that there's a sense in which the transcendent, the beyond, the sacred is mediated somehow by a sounds which transcend language. And so that is really important, that it, again, expresses the content of the cult and shapes people participating in the worship. And beyond that, it of course is a way of handing on and shaping all aspects of human life. So I think we can think about it in modern society as when music is heard, there's some sort of shared thinking about what's going on or shared event about to happen. And we're trying to unify ourselves through this music to enter into that together. And this is because of the nature of music itself. Even when one person is making music on their own, they have reference to a music theory system and a body of music. And so someone can reference the person singing now with all the other times I've heard someone singing now. And it creates meaning, it creates relationship. There's a harmony between something now and something in the past. And when people are creating music together, they literally are putting their bodies in harmony. For example, in choral singing, it's not enough to simply sing the same note. We have to sing it with the same vowel shape. Otherwise, the overtone series, which emerges from it, is different and it'll sound slightly out of tune. So this is about building choral blends. So what do I do to do that? Our bodies are all different. We produce it differently, and we have to have each of us a healthful way of producing that sound. But then we have a shared sound. We're literally putting our bodies in resonance with each other according to whatever the idea that we're sharing is, perhaps dictated by a conductor. And that's the idea that we're agreeing on, where we're responding to that conductor, putting our bodies in resonance with each other. So there's a unifying factor that is both physical and invisible and spiritual, I think, for that reason.
That strikes me as a really valuable consideration, like the necessarily communal nature of music. Even with the individual performer, they're in a tradition, they have an audience, and something like choral singing. I mean, one of the things about choral singing is it becomes one of our images of heaven. I mean, we call angels choirs. You know what I mean? Like there's something about the experience of togetherness, of unity of purpose, that we experience when we sing together or make music together, that hints at something beyond, right? Something transcendent, it feels like we're aiming for that. We're made for something like that.
Yeah.
That I think is really interesting. And then if you're thinking about the school community, right, you want to build a community that is oriented towards eternity, but also that has relationships and things going on right now. And to think about music's role in building community in a school, I think would be valuable.
And the church gives us two main kinds of music. The way in which she speaks about music usually is saying what the purpose of music is, then delineating some qualities that music must have in order to achieve those qualities or achieve those purposes. And then it won't give you a list of don't do this, don't do that, don't do that. Okay. It says some kinds of music are less suitable for achieving those purposes, like theatrical music, because in theatrical music, it's designed to be a performance, and it's not somehow divorced from authenticity, whereas, we're called to authenticity. But the main kinds of music that the church all throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century has mentioned are Gregorian chant and sacred polyphony. And it has an experience of the Holy Spirit as symbol in both of those things. So if we think about Gregorian chant, everybody sings the same thing all at once. And therefore, it is a unique symbol of the unity of the faith, the unity of the church, our unity together. It is in Latin, and so it's nobody's language, and therefore everybody's language. And sacred polyphony, however, is a different sort of experience of the Holy Spirit, that I'm not a bass. That person over there is a bass. That person's a tenor. That person's a countertenor, mezzo, soprano, alto, whatever. All sorts of different voice types. And we sing our own different things to the best of our ability. And they sound amazing together. This is like the church in action, that we are unified. We sound great together. We work towards heaven together. We strive for heaven to get together. But each of us has different gifts in the same spirit.
Right. Yeah. The hand doesn't say, to the foot, I don't need you.
Right.
Right. Help me think about then, moving specifically to, we're already moving specifically to education, but if music is such a central part of human life and experience, and it's related to the transcendent, almost whether we like it or not, even the thing I talked about with Hulk Hogan is a kind of appeal to a kind of transcendent, or I'm thinking of the video for Thunderstruck. If you've ever seen like AC/DC's Thunderstruck, the video looks religious. Not the kind of religion you and I belong to or believe in, but there is a kind of transcendence that's going on in that stadium, right?
Yeah.
And so if it has this kind of role, and if education is the formation of a whole person, then what role does music have in a well-rounded education, and certainly a Catholic education? But I think even before you get to a Catholic education, I think an educated person there's music involved in their education to some degree. So how and let me put one more consideration on the table. I think there's a real danger in our culture, especially with the arts and sports, that we say they're for the people who are good at them. Mm-hmm. And so we've had like a major collapse in like youth participation in sports, because by the time you're 10 years old, if you're not really good, you kind of quit. And I think we do this with the arts and with music too, that if you're not like a really gifted singer, then you just don't really ever sing. Yeah. But in most cultures, everybody sang, right, whether they were good or not, and so that's one more consideration in the back of my mind when I'm thinking about the role of music in an education, is like, it's not a special thing just for the people who happen to be really gifted,
Right. Absolutely. I think I need some more coffee, because for some reason this thinker's name is escaping me right now. Early 20th century person who never became Catholic, but she was very much on the cusp of it. And she had this dialogue.
Simone Weil?
Yes, thank you. Great.
Okay, there we go.
I think Simone Weil. Right. So she had this dialogue with these Dominicans, and she wrote a letter, for example, on thoughts about Catholic education. And I'm very inspired by what she said in it. And this is not music specific, but it is, her fundamental insight was that when you engage in education, you are paying attention to things outside of yourself, and you're developing a habitus and muscular sort of power for paying attention. And paying attention is the heart of prayer, because we pay attention to God. And that's what we'll be doing forever in eternity, is an absolute rapturing of our attention by God. So anytime with any subject that we devote ourselves to study, to strengthening those habits of observing reality outside of myself, I am developing a capacity for prayer and for worship, which is developing my capacity for God, whom I am called to know, love, and serve, and be with forever in eternity. And I think that's really important. And when we talk about music specifically, there was there's a priest who's the founding director of the School of Education at Catholic University of America, who talked a lot about the particular role of art and music in the formation of the human person. Because these are things that are, they have intellectual content. And that's really important to remember. These are not just intellectually void, expressive things that are just everybody's truth is their own truth. There is an expressivity and an entry point that is unique to each person, but there's intellectual content too. When you study music theory, you basically learn that it's applied math. Or, when you study poetry in music, there's a really complex understanding of poetic feet and structure and rhyme and meter and accent and unaccented, and that interacts with the music in a particular way. So it goes beyond even just the study of poetry. But so those things, music in particular, affects us so deeply in terms of our affective life that it whatever's attached to the music gets most deeply embedded in our hearts. And I think this is a really important thing when we live in a culture in which there is both actual noise, people walking around who can't have a hard time doing anything without a set of headphones in their ears. And they think they're listening, but really they've kind of diluted their attention to the music so much that they're not really listening. That's maybe another conversation. Or that there's the noise of digital noise, that there's like a constant influx of information through the eyes and maybe the ears that numbs us to truly listening. So when we develop any capacity for observing reality, really using my eyes to understand everything that I see in this painting, really using my ears to really understand everything here, we're developing a capacity for the outside world, and we're developing that capacity oriented towards things which are really going to deeply embed themselves in my heart. So I have to be sure that what I am giving my eyes to, what I'm giving my ears to, is actually worth listening. I had a great session with some of our students just last week. It was the propedeutic year men, and I had just finished teaching their module, the role of beauty in the spiritual life. And we talked about their final project was actually to make a plan of leisure. Okay, like let's say there are things that you want to do and bad habits you want to break. Like, what are the things you're going to do with your free time to actually achieve those things, both while you're entering into seminary and when you're living your life as a priest? And as part of that class, I also took them to the art museum. I took them to a play, and I took them to a concert. And they asked me later on, saying, no one's ever taught us really how to listen to music. Would you do that? And so I said, yeah, sure. So I had some great beer. And so the guys are in the habit of like making a bonfire several nights a week. So they went out and made a bonfire. I brought some beer, and someone brought a Bluetooth speaker, and I took them through a listening activity. The activity that I had them do was they listened to 4 different recordings of Mozart's Symphony No. 40 in G minor, the first movement. And when you listen to different recordings of the same piece of music, you can start recognizing the tunes. And that's really key for understanding what's going on in the musical development. We talked about, well, how is sonata allegro form structured, and how is the symphony structured? And then you hear, oh, that's faster, that's slower, this is louder and softer, and this is much more subdued, or whatever. You really start noticing things. And this is so important. I think reconnecting with reality. Catholicism is a religion of reality into which God came in a glorious way and redeemed it all for himself and brought it all into his Godhead through the incarnation and the hypostatic union. And so we can rejoice in reality. We don't have to be afraid of any knowledge. We don't have to be afraid of any reality, because they all belong to God. And when I attune my senses to reality, what I'm making possible is that things outside of myself, the real, the true, the good, have the capacity to make their way into my soul.
Awesome. One of the ways we talk about like our basic project, right? Approaching every subject from a Catholic point of view, is that education is, in a sense, an encounter with reality. And each particular discipline is a certain lens onto reality. Poetry is a certain kind of lens onto reality. It's different than algebra. But the reality that you encounter through poetry or through algebra is the same. It's truth is one. Right. And because truth is one, the truth that you discover through music or through poetry or through math or through chemistry or whatever it is cannot contradict, but will always sort of add layers to your understanding. And so what we want to do is expose students through whatever discipline, whether it's a listening exercise, as you described, or a chemistry experiment. The principle, as you articulated it very well, applies in all those different things, right? You're encountering something beyond yourself that doesn't bend to your will, but you have to accommodate yourself to what is, right? And that's a really, that runs counter to a lot of, how our culture talks about things like freedom, right? Which ends up getting us all tangled up because our kids don't have a ton of experience of freedom following our advice to sort of ignore what reality actually is like. It hasn't led them to an experience of freedom. Whereas my guess is in this very concrete, specific example you've given, these people who submitted themselves to that reality came away feeling more free. Yes. They're more themselves. They're more able to encounter and appreciate the good and the true through the beautiful the next time they hear a song on the radio.
Yes.
And so, it's a great discipline-specific example of a general principle that education is an encounter with reality, or you're doing it wrong.
And what is wonderful. And our proper response to what is wonder. And wonder is incredibly happy and joyful. And I think that's what really people are looking for in different notions of freedom. They're actually looking for happiness. And when we can affirm and rejoice in what is as wonderful, I feel most myself. I feel like I have a place in the world. I have a meaning. I have a purpose, and I belong. And I can surround myself with those things which affirm the goodness of reality. And people have different dispositions. Some people I meet, I have students who are generous enough with me to tell me that they don't actually enjoy music that much. And I'd actually rather know that so that I can talk to you about how to be a good priest, even if you don't really like music that much, because you're going to have to care about it,
Right. Yeah, no, it's not, what's the word I want? Didactic. You don't there's always this balance of the objective and the subjective, right? Like there's genuine goodness and beauty, but the only people that ever encounter that are subjects, and they can't avoid that subjectivity. And the danger is to say that objectivity is irrelevant or doesn't exist because we're all subjects. Or the reverse danger is to ignore subjectivity because objectivity is real. And a Catholic approach always upholds both, right? And that applies in music or in any other any other art or any other discipline.
This is a subject that I'm really passionate about subjectivity and objectivity. So, if I could respond to what you're saying,
please.
People think about music as just totally subjective. And this is just a modern notion. This is evacuating the ontological reality of what music is. That there is something outside of myself, which I perceive. And then I myself have an individual reaction to it. And I think, in my experience, it's really helpful to make a contrast between the moral life and aesthetic judgment, moral judgment and aesthetic judgment. So if we can say, well, in the moral life, right, there is a standard of good outside of myself, and it's God. And I have the freedom to choose something that is intrinsically evil or intrinsically good. And God gives me that freedom. And my level of knowledge about the evilness or goodness of things might vary depending on my conscience formation, right? So we know in Catholic teaching, for example, that there are conditions to be met for a sin to be grave. And one of them is knowledge of the evil of something, right? So it's possible to be invincibly ignorant about something being wrong, for example. But anyway, there's a standard of good and bad that I am called to learn more about and be formed in. That's the duty of every Catholic, to form their conscience. And this standard is something that I don't manipulate. And I can talk about the standard without actually engaging in the action. I can know that murder is wrong without committing a murder. Now, if we go over to the realm of the aesthetic judgment, there's something outside of myself, and it has a relationship somehow to the beauty, which finds its source in God. And so therefore it has relationship to an objective reality. And my perception of it might be more or less rich based on my training and my experience, and how, have I had someone teach me how to listen to this piece of music? And if I have, I can appreciate more of its beauty perhaps than if I didn't. But at the same time, there's something about something that's really beautiful that is imminent, that happens right away. And you don't need to have a studied approach to it. You can just know that it's beautiful. In the same way that I think the witness of holiness bears an immediacy on our experience of what's good. But the main difference between the aesthetic and the moral judgment is that I can't just talk about in hypothetical terms whether something is beautiful or not. I actually need to experience it. If I tell you that Mozart's 40th Symphony in the first movement is worth listening to, you might find me a credible source. But when you believe that it is beautiful, you say that you're making the judgment that it's beautiful. All you're doing is asserting my credibility, until you go and you yourself hear Mozart's 40th Symphony, the first movement, with a great conductor like Riccardo Muti or something, and then you're going to know it for yourself. So that's a main difference between the subjectivity in the moral judgment and the aesthetic judgment. And sometimes people just think that, the two are so totally different, but really they're quite similar, except for that standard that you can talk about what's right and what's wrong without committing it, whereas you can't do that. What's beautiful and what's not beautiful without actually perceiving it.
Right. You can reason to the good in a way that you can't reason to the beautiful.
Precisely.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm just thinking, you mentioned, I think you mentioned disagreements in marriage before. And my wife and I had very, very different musical upbringings. Very different. And so we didn't like each other's music. And one of the things we did is we did not super officially or anything, but organically over time, we did music appreciation for each other's music. And to this day, she doesn't love the Tragically Hip, but she can see the good that I see in it. Right. And so we're going to have different subjectivities, but we can also learn to appreciate something
that's right.
That's there. And it's not perfect, and she'll be delighted to hear me say this. I can actually see limitations in the Tragically Hip that I couldn't see before I married her. But anyway, I mean, there's still a great Canadian band. But anyways, you see the point, right? Is there's an encounter with the thing, and these two subjectivities, which are sharing something with each other and learning from each other in a kind of appreciative way, right?
And there are legitimate differences too, right? That in the same way that different Catholics can be on the path to heaven, and one chooses service to the poor as their path and their vocation, and another chooses, working with children as their path to holiness. When you're dealing with different beauties, you can legitimately prefer one to the other. But what you can't say is that one is ugly and the other is beautiful. And my husband, so speaking of disagreements, this is a typical Nowicka family household disagreement. My husband really loves Romanesque architecture, with the rounded arches and the older construction and the really big, thick walls or whatever. And I love Gothic architecture. And, he just feels like it's overdone. He's a more simple kind of guy, but he would never say that Gothic architecture is ugly. And I would never say that Romanesque architecture is ugly. We can agree that they're both beautiful and have a legitimate difference of preference for one over the other. But
Right.
So what we're interacting with is the objective beauty of those two things. And then I can have an affective disposition towards one or the other in the same way as I can like chocolate or vanilla ice cream.
Well, let's move now. It's not like we've avoided it to this point, but let's get explicitly theological. And I want to think about like music's like final end. Like, what is there's all kinds of intermediate goods that we achieve through music in this life and culture and world. But when we think about like the human destiny with God forever in heaven, how do we think about music and its role with respect to that final destiny?
Yeah. Well, I could share with you what the church teaches, which I found
Please.
in my own life a very rich teaching that I think about every day and that I strive to pass on to my students. The church tells us that music has two main purposes, and we're talking about sacred music here. Of course, music in the human experience is participatory through culture, and culture at its root has cult, again, worship at the root of it. And so we can look at the purposes of sacred music as extended through other activities in the human sphere when we're talking about non-sacred music. But the purpose of sacred music is twofold, and it's a hierarchical purpose. The first purpose and the primary purpose is the glorification of God. When I participate in making something of beauty in a way that uses the laws of physics and the laws of anatomy and physiology and human invention and music theory, it glorifies God in just the same way that anything that I can learn with excellence and participate in that affirms the goodness of creation glorifies God. I participate in glorification of God in sacred music. When I make music, it is what the church talked about in the early church as logike latreia, spiritual worship, right? There's a sense in which music in a particular way unites the body and the soul in offering to God. And that's my disposition at Mass. What is my role at Mass if I am not a priest, for example? Well, I participate in the common priesthood of all believers. And that is that I am called to offer myself to the Father in unity with the sacrifice of Christ through the Holy Spirit. That is my job. That's my main purpose at Mass. And the ordained priest does that in a particular way, a way particularly configured to Christ that goes beyond even the common baptism of all the faithful. Music allows me to do that. When I breathe in and use my body, it feels much more like an involvement of my whole body. And my whole body can train my soul to offer itself to God. And my soul inhabits the intention of what my body is doing. If I just go through the motions and my brain is thinking about my shopping list or how much homework I have to grade, then I'm not really inhabiting with the real content of worship what my body is doing. And I just become, as Christ says, a whited sepulcher, someone going through the motions who's kind of fake. But in music, there's a particular unity of body and soul that allows me to worship God in the way that I am called to worship him at the Mass. And I can, outside of Mass, also make those acts of adoration, the looking towards God and offering myself to him. The second purpose of sacred music flows from the first purpose. When I worship God as I ought, when I put him at the center of my life, everything else makes sense. And it leads to my sanctification and edification. So the second purpose that the church says is the sanctification and edification of the faithful. I am made more like God when I worship God. I am built up in the faith. I am confirmed in thinking true things, doing good things, living habitually in unity with God when I worship him. Everything that I need in this life, all the goods flow from the worship of God. And so music does that in a particularly effective way for all the reasons we've been talking about.
I'm picturing a poster in a music classroom or a band or a choir classroom that just says music unites body and soul. Mm-hmm. Like, I think like that's like a soundbite that will land in a high school student's imagination, that will make sense. You have a nice evocative image of someone singing, looking sort of rapturous or whatever it is, right? And it says music unites body and soul, and they will intuitively know that that's true. Mm-hmm. And that, anyways, looking for something like really clean that a teacher could take and do with that, it makes a ton of sense to me. And one of the things we like to think about here is like, what is the nature of the human person, and how does that inform how we think about what they're doing? And if a human person is a body and a soul, and to think about singing or music in those terms, I think is really evocative. And then the other thing I'm thinking of, which is related to that, but also to your second point about worship, is people say, when they struggle to imagine heaven, and that like they'll get bored, just singing praises forever, because that's our, the classic image of heaven is singing praises. And on the one hand, okay, I get it, right? Because we're temporal beings, and if we imagine any activity, no matter how rapturous and transporting, we don't want to do it forever, right? We like, and that's just our experience of being in time, and so I get it. On the other hand, I think the reason that metaphor becomes so dominant in the tradition is precisely because when you do it, you actually lose track of time. You actually become kind of transported into, you touch eternity in a way, right? And so I think there's a way in which it captures something very true to picture heaven, and because we always have to deal with images, right? We can't get at the real thing. Yeah. We're working through images. To picture it as something like communal singing, where body and soul are united, and what we're doing, what we were made to do, so that everything else takes on its right order and proportion in our lives. Like, that's an image of heaven, right? Choirs of angels or choirs of saints. Yeah. And anyway, I want to rehabilitate that image in light of what you just said, because I know why we don't want to do the same thing for thousands of years on end, but still, if you had anything that you were going to do for thousands of years on end, that really might be the one.
Weird to think about what music in heaven is like, because as we mentioned at the very beginning, music is a temporal art. And actually, singing in particular, we talk about the singing of the choirs of angels, but singing is actually particular only to humans because we have bodies. Somehow angels do something that is analogous to singing, but they actually don't sing because they don't have bodies.
Right. Okay, well then, I'm going to use this because there's another one. Listeners to the podcast will know I said in an earlier podcast that angels don't do math because angelic knowledge is immediate.
Indeed.
And math is mediated, right? Mm-hmm. Now, that doesn't mean they don't know what we know by means of math, but that's a different thing. Right. And I think maybe something similar applies here. They achieve what we achieve by means of singing, but they don't do what we do because they're not the same kind of creature that we are. Right. And so one of the reasons for angelology, apart from like, we're curious to know about angels, is if you consider a creature that is like you in some ways, but really different from you in other ways, you could think more clearly about what kind of a thing you are. Mm-hmm. Right. And I think, this comparison with angels, whether it's music or math, gives us a clearer sense of the unique human role within creation and how music might impact that role or shape it. Right.
It sounds like you like the same parts of the Summa that I do. I love reading St. Thomas on angels and the properties of resurrected bodies. It's super interesting.
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, a resurrected body too. When you if music unites body and soul, then resurrection becomes an interesting category to consider too, right? Because then the body separated from the soul is sort of not musical in a certain way, and then the resurrection is a kind of restoration of that capacity. Or anyway, we could geek out on this for far too long. Let me finish with thinking now in light of that vision theological vision of music and the human person. How does that shape how we teach music? And I'd love to hear two things, because we're going to do sacred music, but we're going to learn folk songs. There's going to be pop music. There's going to be musical theater. Like there's music. There's all kinds of music in our schools. And how does this theological vision of music shape both our engagement with sacred music? Maybe that's in the liturgy or wherever else. And how does it shape our encounter with what we're doing in the drama production that's, musical theater, or when we're learning a folk song from, the various heritages of the people who make up our classroom, or any number of places where we would encounter music in our schools?
Yeah. So I will point people to the one book that I think every person on earth should read aside from the Bible. And that is, or the Bible and the Catechism, I would guess. But that is Leisure, the Basis of Culture by Joseph Pieper. Everybody on the planet should read that book. I've read that book.
Amen.
10 times. I read it every year with the men in my classes. And it is the perfect schemata with which to understand how this applies in education. My observation is that Catholic music education is fundamentally centered on singing for the sacred liturgy in an act of worship. And that act of worship inspires different cultural experiences and things that we do, especially in leisure time, that extend out into the whole of human experience. And one of the critiques I would make about a lot of Catholic schools is that they orient their program towards two main things that I think need to be enriched or maybe even reevaluated. One is that they teach to a Christmas program and an Easter program or something like that. And programs are great. We do, for example, an Advent and Christmas concert here at the seminary because, but I have a very specific reason why I do it. I want the men to have the pressure of preparing for a concert in a time crunch in front of a bunch of people to make them better singers of the music that is really what we do, which is singing for Mass and the office. And the only reason we do the concert is so that they get better at singing. And my experience is always that preparation for concert always makes them better at singing for Mass. And that's the main reason we do it, because that's where the rubber meets the road. That's what we're going to be doing forever in heaven somehow, who knows? But we are made for worship. We are made for worship. And your music program has to set up people for heaven, has to set up people for happiness in adult life. And the ability to offer yourself through music in what is most fundamental to you as a person in your being is a great service and a great plan for happiness and human flourishing. And so any music program should be fundamentally oriented towards the habitual production of the most excellent and beautiful sound we can achieve regularly for the sacred liturgy. And if that involves concerts, then that's fine. But that has to be reoriented towards a program which, for example, prioritizes great music at the school Mass. The other main problem that I see in music education programs is this idea of music appreciation. And you alluded to this earlier. You know, if a principal is taking a family on a tour of their school and they take them by a class doing math, and the principal says to the family, you know, our students here aren't really so good at arithmetic, but they really appreciate it when other people do arithmetic well. Those parents would hightail it out of there. They would say, what the heck are you wasting your time on? Why can't your kids do arithmetic? They should be able to do it. And that is absolutely true of music instruction in the Catholic schools as well. People have to be able to do it. And in the doing, they appreciate it more. I am every day working with seminarians who at some point figured out that they couldn't sing, which is just not true. I've been teaching in seminaries for 13, 14 years, something like that. And yes, I have had men who've really struggled to be able to match pitch, but I have not yet encountered even one guy who can't learn to sing the notes that he needs to sing the Mass. He just needs a patient teacher with him who really teaches him how to actually use his body, how to find the difference between his chest voice and his head voice, and get his voice up into those higher notes that don't come naturally through speaking. How do you support that in the body? All those sorts of things. How do you hear what's going on outside you and produce a sound that's exactly the same as that external impulse? That all can be learned. So I think these two fundamental things, orientation towards worship and orientation towards appreciation, specifically through building up skills to actually do it.
It's neat that you picked math as your analogy, because what you said next sounded like what a lot of math teachers say, right? A kid will come into math class thinking, I can't do math. Like, kids get that in their head, that it's just not what they're good at. And math teachers are like, I hate however that got planted in their mind, because I know it's not true. Of course, there are variations in talent in math or in music. Granted, right? Not everyone's going to be a virtuoso. But basically, everyone who doesn't have some serious disability that's related to, if you don't have a voice box, you're not going to learn to sing, right? But if you're not missing some key thing, then you can learn the basics, even if you're never going to be a virtuoso. And I've heard math teachers say almost word for word what you said about music, which I think is fascinating, right? And that the appreciation you would have for music would be qualitatively different if you've put in the effort of figuring some of it out, right? I was even thinking, when you were talking about the guys prepping for the Christmas concert, one of the things it builds as like a side benefit is like compassion for the people who prep Christmas concerts. Right? Like, at a very basic level, having gone through the pressure and everything else, right? It becomes part of your shared human experience. And then the other thing I wrote down to myself, as when you were talking about the basic orientation of a music program in a Catholic school being ordered towards the sacred liturgy, I thought, some people might get a little nervous about what that means for our musical theater or for whatever else. And if I hear you correctly, you're not saying don't do those things, but understand the end goal. And I think what came into my mind that I think is really concrete is, let's say you're a family that goes to the school for a few different events, and you go to the musical theater production, and it is like borderline professional, right? Like, it is exceptionally good, right? And let's celebrate that. Hey, we're really good at this. Why not be good at it, right? And then you go to Mass, and it's awful, right? Or they're like playing something over the speaker, and right, because this happens, right? You will have Catholic schools with dynamite musical theater programs who don't even have actual musicians at Mass. Now, that's an extreme case, but it makes the point, right? That if that's happening, or somewhere along that spectrum is happening in your school, it's a call for reevaluation, because what is being communicated to the students and to the community about what education is about here? I'm all for a gangbusters musical theater program. Please, God bless you, go to town. But what is the message if that is amazing and the music at Mass is awful? If no one has given it any time or attention, you communicate something sort of unmissable to the students about what's really important in life, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. And I think, parents are really interested. A large number of parents are really interested in really giving their kids a great musical education, beyond just every parent wanting their kid to have a great education. And who gets the fruits of that musical education? Those piano lessons, are they forever just, I have my doctorate in piano, so don't get me wrong. Like, my mom invested in my piano lessons, and I played plenty of recitals and all that stuff. But what does the church benefit from it? And is there a place for a person to offer that in the church? In my work with graduate students at the Catholic Institute of Sacred Music, what I find over and over again is that, people are working at Catholic parishes, for example, because they actually want to make their career doing, musical theater, and they need a side job. That was always the case, for example, in New York, right? Like, you meet all these people having music music director jobs in the Bronx because they're going in for auditions all the time in Manhattan. But my experience is that when you show someone you can be a faithful Catholic striving for holiness, and you can be an amazing musician all in one, that is good for the person with those gifts, the parish community in which they offer those gifts, and the impact of that parish community on each person in that parish and outside the walls. It's good for everybody that the locus of people's fruits of their labors and their hard work is the church.
Jennifer, thank you so much for being with me. We're gonna wrap up the shorter public-facing version of the podcast. Listeners who are familiar with us know that there's an extended version available. This podcast is housed in the Making Every Class Catholic online community, so there will be an extended version available. And we're going to talk in the extended version today about how you can start or rejig, if that's what's needed, a program in your own school. So we'll get really practical. But for those of you who are with us for the public-facing version, thank you so much for joining us. Everyone else, we'll see you in a few minutes. God bless. Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, I want to tell you about the Making Every Class Catholic online community. There you'll have access to regular live interactions with me and with plenty of great presenters and presentations, workshops, and Q&A, as well as to a network of committed Catholic educators and a growing library of resources. And be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and most important of all, share this with a fellow Catholic educator. We've got more exciting guests lined up in the months to come. You won't want to miss them. Until then, God bless you in your work, making every class Catholic.